But firstly, the climate debate is intensifying again. Many commentators, me included, thought that Scott Morrison had deftly plotted a course to reduce Australia's carbon emissions when he outlined a long-term agenda for the remainder of his term at the National Press Club last week. But it appears he has raised some real doubts among his own coalition ranks. His Deputy Prime Minister seems confident that Australia will exempt our agricultural sector from any emissions reduction target, but some among the Nationals ranks are not quite so sure. One of them is the former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, who fired a very strong warning shot across the bow of the Prime Minister and his own leader, Michael McCormack, in a powerfully argued opinion piece in the Australian newspaper. Barnaby Joyce, welcome.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and it's great to be on your show.
Great to have you. Let's just listen to what Scott Morrison said at the National Press Club.
But our economic recovery plan, I should stress, is underpinned by something incredibly important, and that is delivering affordable and reliable energy in a way that positions Australia to be successful in the lower and ultimately net zero emissions global economy of the future. Our goal is to reach net zero emissions as soon as possible, and preferably by 2050.
Well, Barnaby, what are we missing about the undertaking that the Prime Minister gave? It seemed to me that he wasn't locking the party into a zero net emissions target by 2050 with all kinds of without any caveats. Are you seeing something there that has alarmed you? And I know your leader, Michael McCormack, also believed agriculture would be exempt, but other Nationals, including yourself, are saying that there seems to be a hidden agenda. What's exactly the issue from your perspective?
Well, I suppose the point we start at here, Catherine, is that we are the reason in regional Australia that we met the Kyoto targets, and that was basically the dispossession of private individuals of their private assets, which was vegetation in their place. When they went to the bank and borrowed the money to buy the place, they bought the vegetation with it, and then they woke up one morning, they'd taken it off them, and then everybody lauded themselves that they had done the most marvellous thing for the planet, met the Kyoto targets, slapped themselves on the back. The bill was paid for by regional Australia. So we've already been down this path, and we listened to the IPCC, that's International Panel of Climate Change, in their last meetings in South Korea, where they said they'll have to get at this with reduction of methane emissions, and bovine ruminant cattle is obviously one of the big ones of those, and guess where they are. And so we see this as a pre-eminent regulation, a further regulation, which is the socialisation of our lives coming into regional Australia. And any person on the Conservative side would say that socialism, whether it comes from the left or the right, is always the worst outcome. And it is social. When you put our private assets in the community's hands without payment, or, so-called communal benefit by reason of an international agreement, not even which basically does both, removes our sovereignty and socialises private assets. So we see that happening again. I listened to Richard Marles the other day on the Insiders on the ABC, and once more he didn't exclude agriculture. We hear on background in the Australian senior Liberals saying that it's about, quote, unquote, cows farting. Well, we're starting to see the signs that to make this equation, this so-called net zero emission equation work, where undoubtedly emissions in the cities will go up, the only way they can do it is to go to the regions and basically start regulating what is ultimately our income stream.
This intrusion on private ownership is quite staggering, and I didn't know it till I read your piece, but the amount of land clearance that was allowed in 1990 as the baseline Kyoto metric and what is now happening in the order of 50,000 hectares per annum now, agriculture becomes unsustainable, doesn't it? And the land holdings of those out in the bush become valueless if government is imposing that kind of condition.
That's precisely it. In fact, I've got in my own, not mine, but my family's business, there are certain properties we just wouldn't bother buying if we had the opportunity because there's too much timber and you can't touch it. Therefore, the land has no value. And this is not only bad for regional Australia, it's bad for Australia in general. Our biggest issue for our nation at this moment, I hate to say it, is not so-called climate politics and climate policy and climate change. It just isn't. Our biggest issue is the preeminent rise of a superpower that's basically not a democracy. It's run by a utilitarian, some would say, tyrannical in form, especially how they deal with the Uyghur superpower, and that's China. That's where our focus should be, and after that, debt. Now, for us to be resilient enough to deal with this in the future and really hand over to our children and our grandchildren a safer place, we have to make sure our nation is a stronger place. We have to make sure our economy is a stronger place. And part of that equation is, of course, expanding our agricultural production, which, of course, if this goes through, is going to be incredibly hard. So your Bradfield scheme become incredibly hard to do in the future because you just won't have, you'll have this new regulatory rope around your neck so that you can't actually expand. And, of course, expanding our manufacturing base, and that's been falling off a cliff, relies on cheap power. Cheap power relies on an expansion of our baseload capacities through such things as coal-fired power. And then, that coal-fired power becomes part of this new pseudo-religion. You're not allowed to say the word. It becomes like Yahweh in the Old Testament. Not allowed to say it or you get stoned to death. And climate politics itself, in many of its iterations, is like a quasi-religion. It has its own tenets. You're not allowed to argue about them. The crime is eternal environmental damnation in a burning planet. The vast number of the adherents don't have a strong scientific understanding of the chapter and verse of their Bible. They follow it by blind obedience. And you've got to always be cautious about getting enmeshed in that sort of zeitgeist. You've got to have a sober stepping back from it and say, well, what is your path? Now, the NFF say, well, we're all for it. Well, how do we help them if in the future we find that the baseline that they start in encompasses all the things that they think that they're going to offer up as a saving? They think they're going to get it by sequestration. That is, I will bury the carbon in the ground and sell carbon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was listening to Professor Wynne just recently, a couple of days ago on Radio National, and he was quite clear and adamant. He said, you will not get it you're not going to get it by sequestration. You're going to arrive at the target by emission reduction, and one of your major emitters is agriculture and methane, and you just have to go into that space.
And you pointed out that the impost on someone with, say, 1,000 head of cattle is enormous, and we've had urban emissions go up 30% in the relevant time, and the bush has taken a massive haircut. And so I can see why some nationals are talking seriously about crossing the floor. But final question to you, Barnaby. Do you have faith in your leadership to take this message on board? You seem to be pretty close to pulling the trigger on this and doing something. And I spoke to George Christensen today as well. And George is very worried about this Glasgow climate change summit at the end of the year. Do you think it's likely we're going to sign up to something that the bush is not ready for?
Well, I can't stop the executives signing up to whatever they choose. I mean, they can go over and sign an agreement. I can't really tackle Maurice Payne at the door. But ultimately, it comes down to Australia, unfortunately, is a very honourable country. Other people sign it up and, giggle all the way back home in their plane, burning up, tons and tons of carbon as they fly home in a jet. But we don't. We actually try to honour our agreements, and that, of course, makes it dangerous. For instance, New Zealand is not going to zero emission. They exempted agriculture, same with Canada. But we unfortunately do what we say, and that can cause us real problems, and especially in trying to strengthen our economy so that if America slides away from its engagement in the Western Pacific, we are a resilient and strong nation, and so have to grow our economy substantially and make ourselves more resilient, if not for China, but to also cover our debt, which we've managed to rack up. So this sort of statement, this benevolent statement about 2050 zero emissions, has many other aspects to it rather than just a feel-good scenario for a city, the inner suburban areas of the major cities, which, if they're honest about it, are actually increasing their emissions, not decreasing their emissions. So,
by some substantial amount.
Yeah, that's why we've got to be cautious. And also, Catherine, as you're fully aware, any debate needs a contrarian argument, and I'm not hearing it. So there is a role for those within the National Party to place that, because the people of Australia deserve to hear both sides of an argument, not this chorus, because once more, that has a sort of a quasi-religious aspect to it, which I always find a little bit dangerous.
Completely understand, and you've made a compelling case. I'm sure most mainstream Australians would be horrified at the idea of an Australia without an agricultural industry. This is about a lot more than coal. Barnaby, thanks for sharing your time with the McGregor angle this evening. I have no doubt that you and I will discuss this further as the year unfolds.
I look forward to it, Catherine. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.